Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 377 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about a famous set of precognition experiments by psychologist Daryl Bem. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to stick around to the end of the episode. We'll have your feedback on our recent episode on facilitated communication and spelling to communicate. But first, in 2011, psychologist Daryl Bem rocked the scientific world by publishing a paper called Feeling the Future. The paper reported the results of a series of experiments Bem had done on whether humans have the ability to subconsciously get precognitive information about the future. The experiments strongly suggested that they did, and that the odds were billions to one against this being due to random chance. Skeptical scientists were shocked. They demanded that other scientists replicate the experiments. And when other scientists did just that, Bem's results held up. But skeptics were so unwilling to accept the results that articles began appearing that announced science must be fundamentally broken. So what were Daryl Bem's Feeling the Future experiments? What were the results they found? And what has happened with the controversy over them? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So, Jimmy, why did you want to cover the Feeling the Future experiments on Mysterious World?
Well, I try to strike a balance between episodes that are story-driven and episodes that are data-driven. Most people prefer stories because, well, stories are stories. They have plots, they have dramatic tension, and they have resolution, and humans are wired for stories. So I try to include stories whenever I can, but we also need to look at data. One of the subjects that we discuss on Mysterious World is parapsychology, which involves psychic functioning. We discussed the field of parapsychology itself in episode 360, but there I could only survey the concepts that are used in the field. I couldn't dig into the data supporting them. In other episodes, like when I've introduced and interviewed former Defense Department psychic spies or told you stories about poltergeists, I've focused on stories involving psychic phenomena, and I could tell you story after story involving that. But if we never get around to talking about the data that has been uncovered in parapsychological experiments, the stories themselves won't be as convincing, especially to skeptics. I found that the most effective way to present a case for something is to both provide stories about the phenomenon in action and to provide statistical data. So today we're going to be looking at a set of high-quality experiments and what they uncovered about psychic functioning. And we'll have a dose of story too, because today's episode has the story of a scientific controversy in it.
Then let's start with a simple question to begin today's mystery. Who is Daryl Bem?
He's a social psychologist and a former professor at Cornell University. He was born in 1938, and he's still alive today at age 87. He originally didn't have anything to do with parapsychology, just mainstream psychology. But by the 1990s, he was asked to start consulting on some parapsychological matters. For example, the parapsychologist Charles Honorton asked him to help with a meta-analysis of Ganzfeld experiments. We can discuss the Ganzfeld technique in future episodes, but basically it's a kind of telepathy test, and it's produced statistically significant results that have held up over time. Well, Bem got interested in parapsychology as a result of his consultations, and he ended up doing his own parapsychological experiments. The most famous of these were published in 2011 in an article titled Feeling the Future: Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect. And it wasn't just published in a hole-in-the-wall journal. It was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is an elite, highly respected mainstream psychological journal. And that only made the study have an even broader impact outside of parapsychology, which is why the skeptics freaked out.
Then let's look more closely at the Feeling the Future paper. What does it contain?
It basically reports the results of 9 experiments that Bem and his associates did. To make these experiments as bulletproof as possible, they were based on conventional, well-accepted principles in psychology. And the tests also involved only super simple statistics that were well accepted, so the results shouldn't be controversial. Because all Bem did was switch the order of a couple of steps to make the experiments precognitive. The way a typical psychology experiment works, you conduct trials in which you have participants go through a sequence of steps. The first step is typically that you give the test participant a stimulus of some kind, and then, as a second step, you measure the participant's response to that stimulus. These experiments follow normal causation, where the cause, the stimulus, precedes the effect or the response. But Bem wanted to force precognition into the experiment, so in his trials, he reversed the order of the 2 steps. So in Bem's trials, first, you measured the participant's response, and second, you gave them the stimulus. Thus, he was testing whether causation could flow backwards in time, retrocausation, so that the effect preceded the cause instead of following it.
We're going to want some examples of how these experiments work to make this concept clear. In fact, we're going to go through each of the 9 experiments he did. But can you start by giving us an easy-to-understand example of an experiment?
Sure. In fact, I'll give you my favorite one, which is experiment number 8. Now, in a conventional psychological experiment, you could do a memory test. One way this could work is that first you show a person a list of words and make sure that they read each word. For example, you might give them the list aardvark, pizza, fireman, sweatshirt, iguana, spaghetti, nurse, and pants. Then you have them practice half the words. For example, you might have them practice aardvark, pizza, fireman, and sweatshirt, and they could write out those words. They could go over them several times. They get some practice. Then, after they've practiced half the list, you ask them to name as many of the words as they can remember. Now, I've simplified this test for purposes of clarity. In reality, you'd want to test a person with a lot more than 8 words because some people can just remember 8 words. So you'd want to give the participants more words than a normal person could remember. You'd also want to randomly select which words they get to practice instead of just picking the first 4 the way I did. But that gives you an idea of how this word recall experiment would work. What you'd expect in this experiment is that the participant would be able to recall more of the words that they practiced because they got to spend more time thinking about these words. They did those words as homework, so they should remember them better. But Bem wanted to make this a test of precognition. So what he did was switch the order of the second 2 steps. In his version, first, you showed the participants the complete list of words. Second, you asked the person how many words they can recall. And third, you let them practice half the words. It's like taking your test before you do your homework. And if the person can still remember the words that they haven't yet practiced, but will practice better than the words that they will not practice, then that's evidence the person was using precognition. That the homework they will do in the future is helping them better remember the words that they will practice on the test in the present, which is pretty mind-blowing if that works. But that's an example of how just switching the order of 2 of the steps can turn an ordinary memory test into a precognitive memory test.
If that's how you can turn an ordinary test into a precognitive test by switching the order of the steps, then let's go through each of the 9 experiments Bem did. How did the first one work?
As we go through the 9 experiments, I'm going to leave out some details for purposes of simplicity so that I can make the concepts clearer and so we can get through them more quickly. But we'll have a link to the original paper so you can read that for the full details. Well, one of the basic facts about human psychology is that men usually find women attractive and women usually find men attractive. There are exceptions, but that's how the human race keeps going. The fact the two find each other attractive is what causes men and women to get together and get busy. And there's an evolutionary reason for that. Any species that reproduces sexually would die out if the two sexes didn't find each other attractive. So the two sexes are programmed on the biological level to seek each other out and mate. And from a Christian perspective, that's by God's design. So Bem wanted to design an experiment that relied on this kind of attractiveness. Here's how Bem explained it in Feel in the Future.
100 Cornell undergraduates, 50 women and 50 men, were recruited for this experiment through the psychology department's automated online sign-up system. They either received 1 point of experimental credit in a psychology course offering that option, or were paid $5 for their participation. Both the recruiting announcement and the introductory explanation given to participants upon entering the laboratory informed them that this is an experiment that tests for ESP. It takes about 20 minutes and is run completely by computer. First, you will answer a couple of brief questions. Then, on each trial of the experiment, pictures of 2 curtains will appear on the screen side by side. One of them has a picture behind it. The other has a blank wall behind it. Your task is to click on the curtain that you feel has the picture behind it. The curtain will then open, permitting you to see if you selected the correct curtain. There will be 36 trials in all. Several of the pictures contain explicit erotic images. For example, couples engaged in nonviolent but explicit consensual sexual acts. If you object to seeing such images, you should not participate in this experiment. The participant then signed a consent form and was seated in front of the computer. After responding to 2 individual difference items discussed below, the participant had a 3-minute relaxation period during which the screen displayed a slowly moving Hubble photograph of the starry sky, while peaceful New Age music played through stereo speakers. The 36 trials began immediately after the relaxation period.
But there was something that the test participants didn't know. Bem explains.
From the participant's point of view, this procedure appears to test for clairvoyance. That is, participants were told that a picture was hidden behind one of the curtains, and their challenge was to guess correctly which curtain concealed the picture. In fact, however, neither the picture itself nor its left-right position was determined until after the participant recorded his or her guess, making the procedure a test of detecting a future event, i.e., a test of precognition.
So despite the fact that the participants were asked to guess where the picture was, what they were actually guessing was where the picture would be, and the placement of the picture was determined randomly after they made their guess. Now, the picture would either be randomly placed behind the curtain on the left or the curtain on the right, with a 50% probability of it being in either place. So you'd expect that by random chance alone, the participant would guess where the picture would be 50% of the time. And the other 50% of the time, they'd see a blank wall when the curtain opened. The hypothesis was that if people are attracted to sexy images and can precognitively sense where they'll be, then they would end up seeing the picture more than 50% of the time. In other words, that the college students would seek out the sexy pictures. Personally, this is a test I would not have participated in since I practice custody of the eyes, so I would have exercised the option not to participate. But I'm not a typical Cornell college student, and the test would still show whether people can precognitively seek out images that they'd like to see. So the first test dealt with precognitive detection of erotic stimuli.
We'll cover the results they got with the test later, but if that's how the first experiment worked, what was the second?
This was sort of the reverse of the first experiment. The first experiment was designed to see if people could precognitively seek out images that they wanted to see. So the second experiment was designed to see if they could precognitively avoid images that they didn't want to see. So it was a test that dealt with precognitive avoidance of negative stimuli. What they did in this one was show a person 2 pictures on a computer screen at the same time, and they asked the person to press one button if they preferred the image on the left and another button if they preferred the image on the right. But the thing was, the 2 images were mirror images of each other that were otherwise identical. The pictures also were emotionally neutral, so you might see a picture of an apple on the right next to a mirror image of the same apple. So there wasn't much of a basis for preferring one picture over its mirror image. What the participants didn't know is that they would also be shown additional images that would be flashed on the screen too quickly for them to consciously notice. So these were being subliminally flashed, and the participants were being subliminally exposed to these additional pictures. Some of these pictures were emotionally positive, like, say, a picture of a pretty sunset, while other pictures were emotionally negative, like, say, a picture of a vicious dog about to attack. What controlled whether you subliminally saw the positive picture or the negative picture was determined by the choice you made. You see, the computer randomly selected either the left or the right image that you saw consciously as the target. So if you were looking at an apple and its mirror image, the computer would select either the left apple or the right apple as the target. Let's say that, unknown to you, it selected the left apple. If you also selected the left apple, then it would reward you by subliminally flashing a positive image like the pretty sunset. On the other hand, if the target was the left-hand apple and you selected the right-hand apple, then the computer would punish you by showing you a negative image like a vicious dog. To make this a precognitive test, the computer wouldn't determine which image was the target until after you expressed your preference. So first, you expressed which picture you liked more, then the computer decides which image was the target, and then it subliminally rewards or punishes you based on which picture you chose. The purpose of this test was thus to see whether humans could subconsciously predict which image would be the target and thus avoid negative stimuli like the picture of the vicious dog. It thus involved the precognitive avoidance of negative stimuli.
If that's the second test involved, how did the third work?
The third test involves a concept that's known in psychology as priming. Bem explains,
in recent years, priming experiments have become a staple of cognitive and cognitive social psychology. In a typical affective priming experiment, participants are asked to judge as quickly as they can whether a picture is pleasant or unpleasant, and their response time is measured. Just before the picture appears, a positive or negative word, for example, beautiful, ugly, is flashed briefly on the screen. This word is called the prime. Individuals typically respond more quickly when the valences of the prime and the picture are congruent, both are positive or both are negative, than when they are incongruent.
For example, let's suppose that the experimenter shows you a positive picture, like a beautiful sunset, or a negative picture, like a vicious dog, and they ask you to assess as quickly as possible whether the picture is positive or negative. So you press one key if it's a positive picture, and you press another key if it's a negative picture. But in a standard psychology experiment, they first prime you by showing you a positive word like beautiful or a negative word like ugly. What priming experience has found is that people are able to answer the question about the picture more quickly if the priming word and the picture are consistent. And they answer the question more slowly if the prime and the picture are in conflict. So, for example, if you're primed with the word beautiful and you see a beautiful sunset, then you'll answer more quickly than if you see the word ugly and a beautiful sunset. Similarly, if you're primed with the word beautiful and you see a picture of a vicious dog, you'll respond more slowly than if you see the word ugly before the vicious dog. In other words, you can answer the question, is this a positive or a negative image, more quickly if the priming word and the image agree than if they disagree, because you have to think harder to ignore the priming word and just focus on the picture. So what Bem did to make this a precognitive experiment was to show the participants the priming word after they'd already made their determination of whether the picture was pleasant or unpleasant. In other words, first the person is shown a picture, then they are asked to decide if it's positive or negative, and only then does the computer randomly show them a positive or negative word as a prime. The hypothesis was that if precognition does not exist, then it won't matter whether the prime and word that the person will be shown after they make their choice is positive or negative. The future prime and word won't make any difference. People will determine whether the image is positive or negative at the same speed, regardless of whether the computer later chooses a positive or a negative word. But if precognition does exist, then the person may see the current picture in light of the word that will eventually be chosen. So it will take them longer to determine if the image is positive or negative based on whether the prime and word that they will see in the future is also positive or negative. In other words, are you subconsciously peeking into the future for help in determining whether the picture that you're seeing is positive or negative? This was thus the first study in whether retroactive priming happens.
If that was the third experiment, what about the fourth?
It was essentially a replication of the third experiment, but with a minor change. Bem explains,
in the original study, the prime paired with each picture was randomly selected on each trial from the list of unused positive and negative primes. In the current replication, one fixed positive prime and one fixed negative prime were assigned to each picture prior to the experiment. These were selected to be semantically relevant to the picture. For example, a picture of a basket of fruit was paired with the positive prime of luscious and the negative prime of bitter. And a picture of a menacing pit bull was paired with the positive prime of friendly and the negative prime of threatening. The computer then randomly selected either the positive or the negative prime before the picture was presented in the forward priming procedure or after the participant had responded to the picture in the retroactive priming procedure.
So it was essentially the same as the previous experiment, but with some refinements. This was thus a retroactive priming experiment.
What happened with the fifth experiment?
This is one of two experiments that's based on the concept of habituation. Psychologists have found that we tend to like things that we're more familiar with, that is to say, things that we've been habituated to. And that's something I noticed years ago. I often don't like an album, a book, a TV show, or a movie as much the first time I listen to or watch it as I like it when I re-listen to or rewatch it. And I've always said to myself, the first time I consume a piece of media, I'm just learning it. I don't know what to expect. But when I reconsume it, it's like, now I see what the artist was going for and I like it better. Psychologists have done studies of how the fact that you've been previously exposed to something increases how positively you feel about it. And it turns out that this happens even when the exposure that you've had is subliminal or below the threshold of conscious awareness. So a typical psychological experiment works like this. First, a picture is selected as the target, let's say a picture of an apple. Then you're repeatedly exposed to this target as it's flashed on the screen multiple times subliminally. Then the target image is paired with a very similar picture, and then you're asked which of the two pictures you like better. Even though you've only seen the target picture subliminally, people still tend to select the picture that their subconscious has seen before. So that's how a normal experiment works. But to make this a precognitive test, Bem changed the order of the steps. First, you're shown two similar pictures. Then you pick which one you like. Then the computer randomly selects one of the images as the target, and then it subliminally shows you this image several times. The idea is to see whether you'll say that you like the image that the computer will choose to subliminally expose you to in the future more than the image you will not be subliminally exposed to in the future. In other words, can you precognitively sense what the picture will be so that it feels more familiar to you and thus you like it more? This was thus a retroactive habituation experiment. When they did this experiment, they tested it with both emotionally neutral pictures, like the apple I just mentioned, and with emotionally negative pictures, like the vicious dog. And the hypothesis was that when they used a pair of negative pictures, people would prefer the image that they would be exposed to more than 50% of the time.
If that was experiment 5, what was experiment 6?
Basically, it was a replication of Experiment 5, so it was also a retroactive habituation experiment, except this time they added a new class of pictures, namely sexy ones. So now there were 3 classes of pictures the participants might see. They might see a pair of neutral images, they might see a pair of negative images, or they might see a pair of sexy images. And the new class of pictures led to a second hypothesis that they were testing. Apparently, people who see a sexy picture over and over again get bored with it, and so they start preferring that picture less. So the new hypothesis was that when people were shown a pair of sexy pictures, they would prefer the one that they would be exposed to less than 50% of the time compared to the picture that they would not be exposed to in the future, since exposure to the target would make that picture more boring for them.
If that was Experiment 6, what happened in Experiment 7?
Well, when they were conducting Experiment 6, they noticed that people did get bored with the sexy picture they would see in the future, specifically if the picture would be flashed more than 10 times subliminally. They would like that picture less. So they decided to design an experiment about retroactive induction of boredom. What they did for this experiment was focus exclusively on neutral pictures. They didn't use any negative ones or any sexy ones. They also decided to try flashing the target picture on the screen for long enough that you could see it with your conscious mind. But otherwise, it worked just like Experiments 5 and 6. First, you get shown a pair of 2 neutral images. Then you select which one you like better. Then the computer randomly selects which of the 2 images will be the target. And then that image is flashed repeatedly, only the flashes are long enough that you can consciously see the image.
You've already mentioned Experiment 8, which was the one that involved remembering words. Can you quickly recap that one for us?
Sure, this one was part of a pair of experiments that involved retroactive facilitation of recall. Basically, they showed you a list of words, then they asked you how many words you could remember, and then the computer randomly selected half of the words and let you practice those. The hypothesis was that if precognition exists, you might be able to recall the words that you would practice in the future better than the words that you would not practice in the future.
Okay, we're now at the last experiment. If that was Experiment 8, what was Experiment 9?
It was basically a replication of Experiment 8, so it also involved retroactive facilitation of recall. The only difference was that after you listed all the words you could remember, they introduced an extra kind of practice. So you got a little more practice with half the words than you would in Experiment 8.
But first, I'm sure you've all precognitively become aware of what I'm about to do. We'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Tomo G, Sharon P., Joel I., Edward R., and Derek M. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. More than 90% of our financial support comes from individual donors like you, and so you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by the debut novel Holy Terror by John R. Doherty. Holy Terror is a gripping supernatural thriller where horrific crimes reveal an invisible war between good and evil. As justice is delivered through mysterious, otherworldly means, detectives and agents uncover a force far greater than themselves. Holy Terror is a bold blend of crime, faith, and the paranormal. You can find author John R. Doherty at johnrdoherty.com. And for those who enjoy audiobooks, Holy Terror is also available on audible.com. Subscribers to John's email list can receive a free copy of the Bible Study Guide Companion at authorjohnrdoherty.com/subscribe. You can find both links in the show notes for this episode on our website. Jimmy, before we reveal the results that Daryl Bem got with his experiments, let's take a moment to reflect on what he was proposing. Wouldn't many people just think that the hypotheses he was testing were just absolutely insane?
For scientists who are hardcore skeptics that don't believe that psychic functioning is possible, yes, Bem's hypotheses sound ludicrous and totally crazy. The idea that you could do your homework after you take a test so that you can better remember the words that you will practice better than the words you won't practice just sounds nuts. So does the idea that you'll like one image better than another because you will see it subliminally in the future more than the other image also sounds nuts, as do the other ideas that Bem was testing. So the whole project sounds absolutely crazy to someone who just thinks that psychic functioning is impossible. Worse yet, the participants in these experiments weren't even gifted psychics. They were ordinary people, just students at Cornell University, and they hadn't been trained in how to use ESP. And they didn't even know how the experiments worked before they took them. For example, they didn't know that after they did the word recall test that they'd be given a chance to practice some of the words. They didn't know that there would be any future homework, so they weren't consciously trying to tap into that homework. Similarly, with the habituation test, they didn't know that one of the images would be randomly chosen and flashed on the screen too fast for them to see. Except in experiment 7, they were never consciously aware of those flashes at all. So they weren't consciously trying to perceive anything in the future. To a hardcore skeptic, this would just sound like craziness piled on top of craziness. Bem was proposing that not only does precognition exist, which is crazy element number 1, but that perfectly ordinary people are using it, which is crazy element number 2, and that they're using it without even trying to, which would suggest that they're always using it in life, which is crazy element number 3. So to hardcore skeptics, this just sounded total bat guano crazy.
You referred to materialist scientists who are hardcore skeptics and believe that psychic functioning is impossible. Do all scientists go into that category?
Well, skeptical organizations would certainly like us to believe that. That's why they sometimes make bald, unqualified statements like, there is no scientific evidence for ESP, or ESP is impossible. But the actual answer is no. There is actually considerable openness to the possibility of ESP among scientists, and it varies depending on which field of science you're talking about. For example, physicists tend to be more open to ESP, perhaps because physicists actually study things like whether time can move forwards and backwards, while ironically, psychologists tend to be among the more skeptical. But the attitude towards ESP in science is quite a bit more open than the skeptics let on.
Then let's look at the results of Bem's 9 experiments. What results did he get?
In general terms, keeping statistics out of it for the moment, Bem found that there was robust evidence for precognition in the test subjects. This doesn't mean that the precognition itself was robust, like in many ESP tests on ordinary people, like the Cornell University students he used. The effect size of the ESP was small, but it went beyond random chance and produced statistically significant results.
Statistical significance is a concept not all listeners may be familiar with. What is it?
It's a concept that is used to measure how likely it is that the results you get could be due to random chance. In science, this is often expressed with what's known as a p-value. You can think of the p in p-value as standing for the probability that your results are just due to random chance and there's no real effect you're measuring. And p-values are expressed as a number that's between 1 and 0. If you had a p-value of 1, it would mean that your results have a 100% probability of being due to random chance. And if you had a p-value of 0, it would mean that your results have a 0% probability of being due to random chance. But in science, you almost never have a 100% or a 0% chance of anything. So p-values are almost always decimal numbers between 1 and 0. The question is, where do you draw the line between what's considered a significant probability and a non-significant one? Different scientists use different thresholds, but the main threshold is a p-value of 0.05, or a 1 in 20 probability that the results were due to random chance. This number goes back to the 20th century statistician Ronald Fisher. He picked the value more or less arbitrarily, but it's become the standard one for most purposes in science. So if you hear someone say that the results of the experiment were statistically significant, that means it had a p-value of 0.05 or less. In other words, that there is a better than 19 in 20 chances that the results were a real phenomenon and less than a 1 in 20 chance that the results were just due to random chance.
Another term from statistics that we're going to encounter is sigma. What do scientists mean when they talk about sigmas?
Sigma is one of the letters of the Greek alphabet. It's the Greek equivalent of our letter S. And in statistics, it refers to a standard deviation. So if something has a value of 1 sigma, that means it's 1 standard deviation away from the mean or average value. If it has a value of 2 sigma, that means it's 2 standard deviations away from the mean. If it's 3 sigma, that's 3 standard deviations away from the mean, and so forth. I won't walk us through all that in detail today, but the bottom line for our purposes is that you can use sigmas as a measure of probability. And the higher the sigma value is, the lower the probability is. In particle physics, the gold standard probability threshold that you need to announce the discovery of a new particle is 5 sigma. 5 sigma corresponds to a p-value of 0.00006, or a chance of only 1 in 1.7 million that the results you got are due to random chance. So if you have a result that's 5 standard deviations away from the average, the odds against your results being due to random chance are so big that you can usually announce the discovery of a new particle. You'll also want to keep the 5 sigma threshold in mind because it's going to come back into our discussion.
Okay, then with that background, let's put some numbers on Daryl Bem's 9 experiments. Let's start with statistical significance. How many of the experiments had that?
8 of the 9 did. All but 1 of the experiments had p-values less than 0.05. The one experiment that didn't was experiment 7, or the retroactive induction of boredom. It had a p-value of 0.096, which meant that there was only about a 10% chance that the result was due to random chance, but a 10% chance is still above the 5% threshold that's normally used for statistical significance. So this one experiment's result was not considered statistically significant. All the other 8 experiments, though, produced results that were statistically significant. For example, experiment 1 had a p-value of 0.01, or only a 1% probability that the results were due to random chance. Experiment 2 had a p-value of 0.009, which is just less than a 1% probability of it being due to random chance, and so forth. But we can go further because we can combine the results of the 9 experiments to see what the overall case they make for precognition is. When you do that, including the one experiment that didn't achieve statistical significance, it turns out that the combined p-value is 2.6 times 10 to the negative 11th power, which means that the odds against the results of the 9 experiments being due to random chance are about 2.7 out of 100 billion, or about 1 in 37 billion. That corresponds to a 6.5 sigma result, so it well exceeds the 5 sigma threshold that is needed to announce a new particle in physics. In other words, if this had been a physics experiment, you could announce a new particle based on what Bem found. He's thus exceeded the gold standard of proof used in one of the most rigorous branches of science. So based on these findings, it's looking not just like precognition really exists, but that it really most sincerely exists.
How did the hardcore skeptics react when Daryl Bem's article appeared?
Well, they freaked out, as you'd imagine. Remember, Bem was proposing what for them sounded like 3 kinds of craziness stacked on top of each other. First, that precognition exists, and second, that ordinary people have it, and third, that they're apparently using it all the time without even trying to. So they just couldn't accept these results. Writing in the Science Encyclopedia, Chris Rowe summarized the situation.
The scientific community's reaction to the article's publication was mainly negative. A New York Times article noted that the decision may delight believers in so-called paranormal events, but it is already mortifying scientists. And quotes the emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Oregon, Ray Hyman, a high-profile skeptic. It's craziness, pure craziness. I can't believe a major journal is allowing this work. Jared included Bem's study among the 10 most controversial psychological studies ever published, alongside notorious research such as Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment and Milgram's shock experiments. Chambers identified the publication of Bem's article as the tipping point that triggered a methodological and statistical crisis in psychology, rather than the dramatic high-profile revelations of fraud perpetrated by psychologists such as Diederik Stapel or Jem Smearsters, the dismal failure of the Open Science Replication Project, or the discovery that many psychologists admitted to questionable research practices, which are all considered in detail later on in his book. Engberg described the research as both methodologically sound and logically insane. And quotes Wagemaker's experience of reading Bem's ESP paper, I had to put it away several times. Reading it made me physically unwell. In the same article, Yuli Shemak, a psychologist at the University of Toronto, asserted, I don't have to believe any of these results because they're clearly fudged.
So skeptics couldn't accept these results, and many just dismissed them out of hand. I particularly like Jan Wagenmacher's statement that he repeatedly had to stop reading the paper because it was making him physically unwell. However, some critics of the paper sought to make more significant objections from a scientific point of view.
Then let's look at those. Before we go further, can you give us a basic list of the objections that we'll be covering?
Well, one of the things that more serious critics agreed on was that Bem's paper followed standard research practices of the time. They generally weren't arguing that he did anything wrong under the research practices of the day in psychology. So instead, they argued that the standard psychological research practices needed to be upgraded. One argument that was made was that Bem needed to more sharply define between exploratory and confirmatory experiments. Another was that he used the wrong kind of statistics in analyzing his results. He should have used what are known as Bayesian statistics rather than the frequentist statistics he did use. Also, that his results could be explained by what's known as the file drawer effect. And finally, that his experiments needed to be replicated. There were also other more technical objections, usually of a statistical nature, and Bem and his defenders had replies for these objections, but they get us way too far into the weeds of statistics, so we won't be covering them today, though we will have links to the relevant articles so that if you're a statistics geek, you can read them and evaluate the arguments and the replies for yourself.
Then let's stick with the 4 major criticisms you've identified. Let's look at the first. What is the issue involving exploratory and confirmatory experiments?
Basically, exploratory research is a kind of open-ended, free-form style of research that scientists use to generate hypotheses that they can then test. By contrast, confirmatory research is what you're supposed to do once you have a hypothesis to test. A difference between them is that you're allowed to change things up when you're doing exploratory research, like you can change up the protocols that you're using and create new hypotheses during the exploratory phase. But once you're doing confirmatory research, you're not allowed to do that. You're supposed to follow the protocol you started the confirmatory study with, because if you're allowed to change the procedures once your study to confirm is underway, well, then you could tweak it to make it say all kinds of things. It wasn't clear to Bem's critics that he always properly distinguished between these 2 different modes of doing research, and the way journal articles were written back then, they made it sound like they didn't change their methodology in mid-experiment, even though they sometimes did. Things are changing on that front, though, and today a solution for this is known as pre-registration. Pre-registration involves publishing your research plan that you're going to use before you even do the experiment. You publish it in what's known as a registry. So it's publicly on record before you even start. And this makes it clear whether you're doing exploratory or confirmatory research, which helps enhance transparency in research, reduce bias, and promote integrity. I'm personally a big fan of pre-registration, though it isn't universally used even today, and it certainly wasn't in general use back when Bem did his experiments.
How did Bem respond to the charge that he didn't adequately distinguish between exploratory and confirmatory research?
Well, he published his paper in 2011, but he'd completed all his research by 2010, and the research itself took place over the decade leading up to 2010. He acknowledged that when he was doing his very first experiments like 10 years ago, he had been looser than he was later, which was not uncommon among people doing this type of research. So he acknowledged that there was at least partial validity to this claim. Fortunately, there is a cure available, which is replication. If other people did replication studies to confirm his findings, that would show whether his hypotheses held up or not.
And we'll cover the replication issue in a bit, but for now, what about the second criticism that was made, that he should have used Bayesian statistics rather than frequentist statistics? What's the difference between the two?
Frequentist statistics are the kind that we've been discussing thus far in today's episode. They involve things like the p-value that we discussed earlier, and they're the classic way of doing statistics. So they're the normal type of statistics that scientists have generally used. However, in recent years, another type of statistics has been gaining in popularity. These are based on the work of English clergyman Thomas Bayes, who lived back in the 1700s. A key aspect of Bayesian statistics is updating your beliefs based on new evidence you get. So before you run an experiment, you already have an idea of how likely you think a particular hypothesis is. This belongs to your prior beliefs, or priors, as they're called. Then you run an experiment and you get new evidence, and then you modify your priors based on the new evidence you got, and that gives you a new estimate of what's likely the case. For example, suppose that you think psychic functioning is overwhelmingly unlikely to exist, but then you do an experiment and you get a little bit of evidence suggesting it does exist. Well, that little bit of evidence that's new isn't going to completely overcome your prior belief that it's overwhelmingly unlikely, but it will modify your prior belief a little bit. So now you'll think that psychic functioning is still unlikely, but a bit less unlikely than you did before you ran the experiment. One of the bad things about Bayesian statistics is that it's got a big element of subjectivity in it. That's one of the reasons people often use frequentist statistics. People can have radically different priors on the same subject, and if you're determined that a conclusion must be true or must be false, then you can just set your priors so that you get the conclusion you want. But conversely, one of the good things about Bayesian statistics is that it forces you to state your prior beliefs about a matter, so other people can look at your priors and see whether they think they're reasonable or not.
What do you make of the criticism that Bem should have used Bayesian statistics in his paper rather than the frequentist statistics he did use?
I think both approaches have their uses, and Bem acknowledges that too. In fact, in his original 2011 paper, he acknowledged that there were other statistical techniques that he could have applied, but he said he was only using super simple frequentist statistics because most psychologists weren't familiar with the fancier techniques, and he wanted other psychologists to replicate what he did. Well, it's certainly true that they didn't know a lot about other fancier techniques. Even today, most scientific papers still use frequentist statistics, and many scientists don't really have a detailed grasp of how to use Bayesian statistics. They're only gaining in popularity right now, and they haven't yet become dominant, and they may never become dominant for some tasks that are just better handled in a frequentist way. But Bem had no problem subjecting his results to a Bayesian analysis. In the same year that he originally published back in 2011, Bem and two colleagues, Jessica Utz and Wesley Johnson, both of whom are statisticians, published a reply to some of Bem's critics. The critics had expressed their priors by saying that the odds against psychic functioning were a number very, very close to zero, and they proposed what was basically the number 100 quintillion to 1 as the odds against psychic functioning. More specifically, they said that it was 99 quintillion, 999 quadrillion, 999,999,999,999,000, and 999 to 1. But if you round that off to 100 quintillion to 1, it's a 1 followed by 20 zeros, which is just another way of saying it doesn't matter what evidence you produce, we're just never going to accept this. They just picked a number out of the air to get the result they wanted. In fact, they admitted that this was an arbitrary number that they were using for purposes of illustration because it was so close to zero. So I don't consider that a serious argument from a statistical point of view, but it illustrates the advantage I mentioned for Bayesian statistics, which is that it forces you to state your priors so that others can look at them and see if they're reasonable or not. Bem, Utz, and Johnson also reanalyzed Bem's own results in terms of Bayesian statistics, using priors based on other known psychological test results rather than just numbers plucked out of the air. And based on this number, they concluded that the chance of psychic functioning not being real, given the data that Bem had collected, was 7.3 times 10 to the negative fifth, which works out to about a 1 in 1,400 chance on Bayesian analysis. They also calculated what is known as a Bayes factor for the two models, that precognition exists and that it doesn't exist based on the data Bem got. A Bayes factor is a concept that's too technical for us to go into here, but we can cover the implications for Bayes factors of different strengths. Basically, if a Bayes factor is between 1 and 3, it's scarcely worth mentioning. If it's between 3 and 10, there is substantial evidence for the hypothesis. If it's between 10 and 30, there is strong evidence for the hypothesis. If it's between 30 and 100, there is very strong evidence for the hypothesis. And if it's over 100, it's commonly regarded as decisive evidence for the hypothesis. Well, based on the results Bem got in the experiments, he and his two statistician colleagues calculated that they were looking at a Bayes factor of 13,669 in favor of precognition existing. Well, 13,669 is much greater than the 100 that would ordinarily be considered decisive evidence in favor of precognition by that reckoning.
Then let's look at the third criticism you identified, which concerned the file drawer effect. What is the file drawer effect, and how could that be playing a role here?
The file drawer effect is a form of what's known as publication bias in science. The basic idea is that scientific journals like to publish studies that have statistically significant results. They don't like publishing studies that have non-significant results. And so if a researcher does a study and the results are not significant, he's not likely to get it published. Instead, it'll just go into his file drawer and no one will ever see it. The result is that when you scan the published literature, if you do a literature review, you'll get a distorted picture of what the research actually says. For example, let's suppose someone has been testing a new drug. We'll call it drug X. And when they run a test, they get statistically significant results that drug X helps people. And they publish their results. So there's now one study in print that says drug X helps people. But let's say 4 other researchers test drug X and their studies don't show statistically significant evidence that it helps people. They show that it doesn't work any better than a sugar pill. And since their results aren't statistically significant, they don't get published. Their studies just go into the researchers' file drawers. The truth is that we have one study suggesting that drug X helps people and 4 studies suggesting it doesn't. So it looks like that one study is likely an outlier that should not be relied upon, and drug X doesn't really help people. However, because of the way publication works, if you do a literature review, all you'll turn up is the one study saying that it does work. And so you'll conclude that this is likely the case. The publication bias or file drawer effect has given you an inaccurate picture of what the research says about drug X. Well, that doesn't just happen in medical testing. It happens all over science. Fortunately, parapsychologists are on top of this issue and have been leading the way. Just like parapsychologists have embraced pre-registration more than their colleagues in other fields have. they also hold themselves to higher standards in terms of publication bias. And so parapsychological journals do publish studies that came back with null results, ones that weren't statistically significant. For just one example, I'd point you to the July 2023 issue of the Journal for the Society of Psychical Research, which published the results of a study on whether people could tell whether someone was listening to them on the telephone. There has been previous work that has shown that people can tell better than random chance when someone is watching them or not watching them. All those old movies you've seen where someone says, I feel like we're being watched. That's a real phenomenon, and it's been studied, and it turns out people can, better than random chance, tell when someone's watching them. So the researchers wondered, would the same thing happen with sound as with sight? So could you tell whether someone's listening to you talk on the phone, or could you tell when no one is listening to you talk on the phone? Well, they did their study, but the results of the study were not statistically significant. But the parapsychologist who did the research and the journal still published a research note on it so that the data wouldn't be hidden in file drawers and future researchers could access it. It would be out there as part of the public record. And this is another example of how parapsychologists tend to hold themselves to higher standards than scientists in other fields.
So, back in 2011, some of Daryl Bem's critics wondered how many studies on precognition might be sitting in people's file drawers that didn't show precognition existed. How did he respond to this?
Oh, he was straightforward about the subject. In fact, in the 2011 paper, he openly discussed and named several exploratory studies that he had done precisely so they wouldn't be in the file drawer, so to speak. But there are also ways you can control for the file drawer problem. For example, you can estimate, how many unpublished studies there would have to be to wipe out the statistical significance or the effect size found in the published ones. And a 2016 meta-analysis of replications that had been done of Bem's initial experiments did just that.
And that brings us to the subject of replication, which is always important in science. Do the results of a study hold up when other people try the same experiment? What happened with replication and Daryl Bem's experiments?
Well, replication was something that he very much wanted. In fact, he'd planned for it from the beginning, and to encourage it, he even did something that almost nobody in science does. As he explained in his 2011 paper,
the experiments have been designed to be as simple and transparent as possible, drawing participants from the general population, requiring no instrumentation beyond a desktop computer, taking less than 30 minutes per session, and requiring statistical analyses no more complex than a t-test across sessions or participants. As noted in the introduction, the goal in this research program was to develop well-controlled demonstrations of psi that could be replicated by independent investigators. The research strategy was to design experiments and employ statistical procedures that were as simple, as transparent, and as familiar as possible.
Consequently, Bem made the test packages and the instructions on how to use them freely available. Any researcher who wanted could install the programs on his computer and start replication studies. In fact, because Bem had been sharing his results throughout the 10 years that he worked on the project, some parapsychologists were already doing this even before the 2011 paper came out. When the paper did come out, additional researchers also started replication studies, and some were skeptics who failed to replicate his results. In some cases, this was because they didn't do true replications, but made fundamental changes to the methodology, like administering the tests online, where you have no guarantee that the participant is given their undivided attention to the test or doing something else at the same time. Skeptical members of the press were quick to trumpet that a few of these replications failed. However, others confirmed Bem's results. And in 2016, Bem and 4 other colleagues published a meta-analysis that combined the results of Bem's test with the replication studies. The abstract of that meta-analysis summarizes it this way.
In 2011, one of the authors, Daryl Bem, published a report of 9 experiments in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, purporting to demonstrate that an individual's cognitive and affective responses can be influenced by randomly selected stimulus events that do not occur until after his or her responses have already been made and recorded. A generalized variant of the phenomenon traditionally denoted by the term precognition. To encourage replications, all materials needed to conduct them were made available on request. We here report a meta-analysis of 90 experiments from 33 laboratories in 14 countries, which yielded an overall effect greater than 6 sigma, p equals 1.2 times 10 to the power of negative 10.
So, using frequentist statistics, the p-value of Bem's experiments plus the replications, including ones that failed, was still 1.2 times 10 to the power of negative 10, which means that there would be about a 1 in 10 billion chance that the results were just due to random chance. And this is still an effect that is greater than 6 sigma. The authors also did a Bayesian analysis, and the abstract continues.
A Bayesian analysis yielded a Bayes factor of 5.1 times 10 to the 9th, greatly exceeding the criterion value of 100 for decisive evidence in support of the experimental hypothesis.
5.1 times 10 to the power of 9 is basically a Bayes factor of 5 billion. So that well exceeds the threshold of 100 for decisive evidence in support of the hypothesis that precognition exists. But because these figures include Bem's original test results, you might wonder what would happen if we pull those 9 experiments out. And the abstract continues.
When Daryl Bem's original experiments are excluded, p equals 1.1 times 10 to the negative 5, and the Bayes factor value is 3,853, again exceeding the criterion for decisive evidence.
So even without Bem's original experiments, and including replications that didn't work, the frequentist p-value is still 1.1 times 10 to the negative 5th. Which means a 1 in 100,000 chance that the results were due to just random chance. And the Bayes factor was still almost 3,900, well exceeding the value of 100 needed for decisive evidence. The results upon replication, taking into account both the attempts that didn't work and those that did, still strongly supported Bem's conclusion. And the authors of the meta-analysis did what are known as fail-safe calculations to see whether other things like the file drawer effect could be responsible. One of their conclusions was,
the number of potentially unretrieved experiments required to reduce the overall effect size of the complete database to a trivial value of 0.01 is 544.
So there would have to be another 544 unpublished studies sitting in file drawers in order to bring down the significance of this study to a trivial level. And that's not plausible because there are very few people working in the field of parapsychology. 544 is multiple times the number of people actually doing parapsychological research. So each parapsychological researcher in the world would have to have done multiple studies on precognition and then not published them, which is not plausible, especially given the fact that parapsychological journals do publish studies with null results. The authors also did additional fail-safe tests and concluded,
7 of 8 additional statistical tests support the conclusion that the database is not significantly compromised by either selection bias or by intense p-hacking, the selective suppression of findings or analyses that fail to yield statistical significance.
So basically, none of the proposed criticisms looked like they had merit, and Bem's conclusions stood up to replication.
And now, what can we say about Bem's Feeling the Future article from the faith perspective?
Well, it hinges on whether precognition exists, and that's something that the Catholic understanding of the Christian faith doesn't have a problem with. There have been doctors of the church who believed in precognition as a natural human ability, For example, Pope St. Gregory the Great held that
sometimes it is through a subtle power of their own that souls can foresee the future. At other times, the future is made known to them through revelation shortly before death. But there is evidence to show that sometimes the soul, by its own subtle powers, has knowledge of the future.
Similarly, another doctor of the Church, St. Thomas Aquinas, held that precognition is a natural human ability. He referred to it as natural prophecy to distinguish it from the supernatural prophecy that God gives. And he said,
this natural prophecy differs in 3 ways from that supernatural prophecy about which we are now speaking. It differs first in this, that the prophecy of which we speak gets its foreknowledge of future things immediately from God, although an angel can be an intermediary inasmuch as he acts in virtue of the divine light. But natural prophecy is due to the proper activity of second causes. Second, it differs in this, that natural prophecy extends only to those future events which have determinate causes in nature, but the supernatural prophecy of which we speak relates indifferently to all things. Third, they differ in this, that natural prophecy does not foresee infallibly, but predicts those things which are true for the most part, whereas the prophecy which is a gift of the Holy Spirit foresees the future infallibly.
So in Aquinas' view, natural prophecy or precognition won't let you know the future infallibly, only God can do that, but it will give you a probabilistic description of the future, which corresponds to the findings of modern parapsychology about precognition, according to which precognition is not infallible. In any event, I don't see any fundamental contradiction between Daryl Bem's findings in his Feel in the Future study and the teachings of the Christian faith.
And so, Jimmy, that brings us to the bottom line. What is the bottom line?
Daryl Bem rocked the scientific world in 2011 when he published his Feel in the Future article. It reported the results of 9 precognition experiments done on ordinary people. The experiments used established psychological principles from other experiments. They just time reversed them to force precognition into the picture. And 8 of the 9 experiments showed statistically significant results. They suggested that ordinary people are using precognition all the time to navigate their environments without even being aware of it. And they reported a 6.5 sigma result with odds of billions to 1 against the results being due to random chance. Hardcore skeptics naturally freaked out. They made a few points that Bem agreed had merit, like he could have more clearly distinguished between exploratory and confirmatory research in his very first experiments. But both parties agreed that the real proof or disproof would be found in replication efforts. Bem went out of his way to let other scientists make replication efforts, and by 2016, a meta-analysis of more than 90 experiments showed that Bem's results had held up, and we do indeed have strong evidence that precognition exists.
And Jimmy, what further resources can we offer the listeners and viewers?
We'll have links to information both about Daryl Bem and about the Feel in the Future experiments from the SPR's Psi Encyclopedia. We'll have a link to Daryl Bem's original 2011 Feel in the Future paper, a critique from 2011 of Feel in the Future, also the follow-up from 2011 where Bem and 2 statisticians responded to the criticism, and the 2016 replication article. We'll also have a link to Slate Magazine, which ran a piece on how this all showed, what Bem had done had showed how science is broken. We'll have a piece by medical doctor and parapsychologist Larry Dawsey called Why Are Scientists Afraid of Daryl Bem? We'll have an article by Kate Nussenbaum on Bem and the Broken Science article, and we'll have a link to Rational Wiki and what they have to say about the Feel in the Future study. And I note that even though Rational Wiki tends to be really snarky, their page on this one is unusually subdued.
Very good. And now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. And this feedback comes from our episode 370 on facilitated communications. Our first feedback comes from Alistair Rebello 9013 on YouTube, who writes, I'm a father of a severely nonverbal autistic preschooler boy. This was tough to watch. A real roller coaster of emotions on the facilitated communication part. I had to stop multiple times. It was brutal to grieve along with the parents as their and my hopes were raised and then crushed. By the time I got to the end, I've given up any hopes of my own son being so fortunate as the young man and girl. We simply don't have the time, energy, monetary assistance, or hope to try. I can't bring myself to share the video with my wife, even though there is at least the benefit of knowing to avoid facilitated communication. I'll keep watch over that myself. All I have left is my faith in God, nothing else.
Alistair, I'm so sorry to hear about your situation, and I knew that this episode would be challenging for folks who have to deal with the more severe forms of autism, and I tried to be as sensitive as I could in it. I did think it was important to let people know about the problems with facilitated communication and similar techniques. I wouldn't give up hope, and there's always new stuff being discovered. I'm glad that you have faith in God, and that's the most important thing from an eternal perspective, because our lives are finite and eternity is not. But I do want to offer you what hope is available, that there may be things out there that could help your son, or there may be things that will be developed that could help your son. And so don't give up hope and keep looking.
Then Ted Seabaron on YouTube writes, I'm autistic. Communication is key. For me, due to the fact that I'm high functioning, Sesame Street and Cat in the Hat worked. I've had a lifelong love of literacy. Canner's autism sufferers are the ones who are usually mute. Having said that, there are many autistics who are lower functioning who still have savant abilities. Using a savant ability to learn to communicate can be helpful if you can discover a savant ability or obsession. My father has aphasia after a stroke. We got him a picture board computer.
Thank you, Ted. I'm sorry to hear about your father, but I'm glad you've been able to get him some help. And I'm glad that you also have been able to have a lifelong love of literacy. That's wonderful. And it's an illustration of how other folks on the autism spectrum do not have the same kind of problems as some of the children we discussed in the episode on facilitated communication.
Kayla J741 on YouTube writes, I work with autistic teens teaching them math, and they communicate with spelling boards. The intense help with communication in the beginning is to help them overcome their mobility issues and to learn how to use the speller. Once they overcome those issues, they will spell things, and I've seen it, without any encouragement or prompting. When I tutored a 20-year-old who was nonverbal, I would ask him questions about fractions and ask his helper not to help him. I just wanted him to do the math in his head and give the final answer. He consistently got them right, again without prompting, but with spelling. At times he did make mistakes, but they were the exact same answers I would assume neurotypical students to make, given a specific misunderstanding of the concept.
Yeah, I'd have to, of course, see the exact procedure that you're describing to make an evaluation of it. But as I pointed out in the episode, there are people who use spelling to communicate who have graduated to a point where they can do it without someone holding the board and without anybody, in physical contact with them. And that really narrows down the possibilities of how any influence might be happening. I mean, you still have to be careful that it's not happening with verbal prompts and so forth. But there is a range of abilities here, and I'm not at all dismissive that some people who are otherwise nonverbal may be able to benefit from these techniques.
Rob C. sent in an email, says, I thought today's episode was excellent. It's a subject I haven't heard of, but I was fascinated throughout. Before you suggested ideomotor effect and presented the evidence that it likely influenced messages from facilitated spelling, I had thought that the clever Hans effect might be the cause, where the speller is trying to please the facilitator by reading cues given from the facilitator rather than generating new information. I would think that even when the facilitator is not in physical contact with the speller or the board, like in spelling to communicate, clever Hans effect could still be relevant, and that constant verbal prompting spelling to communicate adds another medium for cues to be given, detected, and used to influence the content of typewritten messages. I think you're right that double blinding the test would detect if clever Hans effect were allowing information to pass from the facilitator to speller. Thanks for another great episode.
Thanks very much, Rob. And for folks who may not be aware, I'll explain what the clever Hans effect is. Hans was the name of a horse in the 19th century who was famed for apparently being able to do math problems. So you could go to Clever Hans. He was called Clever Hans because he could do the math problems. And so you'd go to the horse and say, what's 7 plus 5? And he would then beat with his hoof 12 times. And this was regarded as a remarkable illustration of animal intelligence. But there were skeptics, and the skeptics observed carefully what Clever Hans was doing with his handler, because he had an owner who was there who would be, holding his reins or whatever when he was doing one of these math problems. And what they noticed was that the handler would be nodding his head along with the hoof beats. And so if you say, what's 5 plus 7, the handler would be nodding along, and he'd get up to 12, and then he'd pause, and Clever Hans would then realize, oh, now is when I need to stop. So instead of actually doing a math problem, what Clever Hans was doing was just beating his hoof until he got the cue from his handler to stop. And the handler was totally innocent in this. It was just like in the facilitated communication procedures that we talked about. In fact, I could have cited Clever Hans in that episode, but it was basically the same thing. It wasn't true authorship on the part of the horse. The horse was just responding to the cues of his handler.
Right. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about Daryl Bem's Feeling the Future experiments and what they suggested about precognition? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work in this episode. Check it out by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. I have loads of videos there for you, including Mysterious World and all the other stuff I do on YouTube. While you're there, be sure and like, comment, share the videos, and subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video.
I also want to thank Rob Mady for his voiceover work on this episode. So, Jimmy, what are we going to be talking about next time?
Next week, we're going to Southwest Oklahoma to a town called Honubby, and we're going to be discussing Bigfoot. Southwest Oklahoma is a hotspot for Bigfoot reports, and back in the year 2000, there was an event known as the Honubby Bigfoot Siege.
Interesting. Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends, write a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast from. That helps us grow our community and reach more listeners. Be sure to get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/377. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at gradygroupinc.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.